I'm going to talk a lot, some numbers here, a lot of statistics. It's based on 123 years of recorded weather observations that have been going on in the Fort Worth and Dallas-Fort Worth area. It started in downtown Fort Worth in 1898, daily observations, in October of that year, and have been going on every day. They moved the site in '53 to the Southwest International Airport. If anybody remembers that, they closed that for, of course, DFW, and they moved it into DFW. There, and that blue dot that you see down here in the bottom right, that's about where the observation site is. They didn't want to tell exactly because of one of you guys might decide that we had extra rain one year or something. So the reason I'm talking is to kind of update going on with the weather and what it means for us gardeners. So the effects of global warming is changing our local weather, and if you've been gardening in the same spot for a couple of decades, like my father did, he gardened in the same spot next to a lake outside Nashville, Tennessee for 44 years. He saw these changes in the last decade of his gardening career. And you've probably noticed them as well, I would guess, if you've been in the same spot for more than 20 years. Temperatures are getting warmer overall. The growing season is getting longer. That's the good news, right? We're getting a longer growing season. We're getting bigger precipitation events. They're getting more common in what's going on. What's also been going on that we've noticed over the last 20 years is the weather's getting more extreme. We're getting more extreme events. Drought patterns are getting more extreme. Wet patterns are getting more extreme. We're getting increased frequency and duration of tropical events. And during the fall, as you know, we get a lot of our big rains from tropical systems, both out of the Atlantic and the Pacific, that come over the Baja. So you might have noticed a little cold snap that we had in February. Remember the little cold snap that we... There are so many things that summarize my points about that event. One is that up to February 8th, it was the 33rd warmest winter on record. It was a nice mild winter that was going on. And what was going on is that all that cold air up in Canada was getting bottled up for months on end. And eventually it was going to break through. And it did. But when it came down, it was the coldest air mass that we had seen in decades that came down. And of course, as we often say, there's nothing between us and Canada but barbed wire, right? It just comes right down the plains. From February 9th to February 20th, that was the coldest those dates have ever seen, period, in the 123-year history. The average high was below freezing across those days, by the way. The average high was below freezing. That's just so rare around here to have that kind of streak of cold. But it does kind of follow a trend. The two warmest winters we've had since 2000, this century, was the winter in 2016-17. The second warmest was the one that started this century. Of the 20 warmest winters at DFW, 8 have happened since 2000. So winters are getting warmer. Again, this is 123 years of record, so we have a pretty good record of it. And this is the thing I've noticed the most just in the 4 years that I've been gardening in my backyard. I've been in my house for, this actually will be the 6th fall season. And I've noticed that the winters are getting a little strange in that they're starting later, ending sooner, and then we'll tend to have these odd freezes after that. You know, that we're still getting cold spots up through April, but for the most part, it's warm starting somewhere around mid-February. So if you think about Groundhog Day, which starts at February 2nd, over the last 50 years, we've seen the average temperature of that 6 weeks go from 50 to 54 in the last 50 years. And quite honestly, most of that has really happened in the last 20. So that's winter. Let's talk about spring. Spring is starting earlier. Of the 3 warmest springs of all time, in the all happened in the last 15 years. The top 3 warmest springs we've ever had have happened just in the last 15 years, 2012, 2006, 2017. And if you take a list of the top 20 warmest springs ever, 10 have happened in this century since 2000. And of course, summers. Summers are always tough here for anyone who gardens, because you can usually get through a winter okay, but you'll never get through a summer. I mean, summer's going to come here, and it's always going to be brutal, and you got to plan accordingly, plan your watering accordingly, plan your soil accordingly, because you got to get your plants through the heat. 2011 was the warmest summer on record at DFW, and if anybody was here during that time, you're not going to forget that summer. That was 70 days we had over 100. 70. There was a month in July, every day was over 100 except for one, the very first day. And of the 20 warmest summers we've ever had, 8 have happened this century. We're getting more above normal days, of course, as everything is warming up, which means your average high now during parts of July, August is now 97. That was just adjusted here this year. And we have more days above that by almost a month's worth now. That going through the summer, we have more above normal days. So not only is a rule on the average is it getting hot, but we're actually getting hotter days that are above the average. We're getting longer streaks of 100-degree weather, where you get back-to-back 100-degree days. They're coming in chunks now. We get 5 or 6, then we get 7 or 10, and then sometimes we get a whole month's worth. That's been the trend since we've gotten into this century. What's really hard on plants, as you guys probably know, is the overnight temperatures. We need to cool down. Plants need to cool down. We're getting warmer nights. A lot of this is attributed to the urban heat island effect. But overnight lows that stay above 80 degrees. Back in 2011, we had 55 nights of those. It was stunning because it shattered the previous record that was set just the year before, or a couple years earlier, of 39 nights. And that's kind of what showed up. 6 of the top 10 warmest summer nights have happened here since 2000. And that just seems to be all crowded up into the last 5 years. Fall has been the most dramatic. And when you think about it, it would make sense because summers are hotter, lasting longer, winters are waiting. So fall is getting pressured on both sides, right? So falls are certainly warmer, and that's where the biggest jump in actual average temperature has happened of all the seasons. It's been fall. It's been up 3 degrees. And again, that's over the last 50 years, but we see the majority of the increase in the last 10 or 15. Of the top 10 warmest falls on record, in the 123-year record, 5 of the 6 have happened in the last 16 years. So falls have been dramatically warmer. And I don't know, was it 3 years ago? I'm big into fall garden. I love my greens. Was it 3 years ago or 2 years ago? It's so sad, I don't even want to remember. It was hot all the way through October and dry. I couldn't get anything started. And then when I finally got my greens started, we had a very early freeze. And it killed everything because they were too young. And that was just the year I did not have a fall garden. What you're looking at is actually 123 lines. They're kind of blurred together because of averages. The lines that are white, average temperature. The lines that are blue, below normal temperature for the year. The average temperature for the entire year. This is 123 lines, 123 years. Notice where the red ones are. They're all piled up here at the end. And the brightest ones are the warmest years. We had a killer summer in 1980. Who was here in 1980? I bet you'll never forget that summer. I'm afraid to say that that's going to be our summers. That we broke that record a couple of years ago, and all the trends would suggest that that summer of 1980 becomes pretty much our summer around here. So we have to garden accordingly. We're going to have some serious heat during the summer. And like I said earlier, I don't know about you guys, but that's always the weakest link in my garden. Can I get the plant through the hot season? The top 5-10 warmest years have occurred this century. In fact, since 2006, the top 5 warmest years of all time for the DFW area. I was saying earlier that things are getting so much more extreme, you know. And just think, this is in the last 10 years, just in the last 10 years. We've had the warmest year, the warmest spring, the warmest summer, the warmest fall, and the warmest winter. It's just in the last 10 years. Out of 123 years, this has happened in the last decade. So I'm going to assume, I think we should all assume, the warming trend will continue. We'll continue to see warmer seasons, warmer years. But what gets a little troublesome in all this, and the best way to explain it, in the big picture, as the atmosphere warms up, the most key component to it is it holds more moisture. Moisture is gasoline to a thunderstorm. The latent heat in the water is what powers thunderstorms. Water, when it's warm, is cooled in the upper levels of the atmosphere, it releases heat. That powers these storms. So the more water you have, the more power you have in storms. The warmer the air is, the more water it can hold. So we're getting more dramatic weather because the storms are stronger. In 2015, we had more tornadoes than we'd ever had in any one year. We've had monster rain events. Just in 2015 and 2018, we had the 1-2 wettest years on record. More than, in 61 inches, that's almost twice what we typically get in a year. And other things happen too. Because the pattern is more dynamic, it can lock down and stay locked. So we can get into a drought, a flash drought, that it was just bone dry suddenly. Or areas on the West Coast get into a drought that won't end, it seems. And we get into a wet pattern because of it. Everything is related to where the ridges and troughs are kind of semi-permanent during the weather pattern. And the weather pattern is getting more powerful. So we get these long dry spells. Back in 2000, we started this century with the longest stretch of dry weather ever. We had the most 100-degree days this century in 2011. We had the biggest 24-hour snowfall this century when we had 12 inches in 2010. And we had the earliest last freeze ever. That was in 17. I hate to brag because I look at the weather, but I kind of saw that one coming. I planted tomatoes. I planted tomatoes in the 3rd week of February. And they were, no, it was the 3rd week of January. And I had a banner crop. Because we didn't get another freeze. I mean, think about it. The record was in the 1st week of February, the 8th, right? Yeah, it was the 4th. That was the previous record of the earliest last freeze, and even that was an outlier. And then suddenly, we get one, we're on January 8th. That's the last freeze we got that spring. That's Florida. That's just amazing. Best tomato crop ever. As I said, weather is getting more extreme. We're getting wet winters. We've had wet springs. We've had wet summers. We've had the 2 wettest falls ever. That little cold snap we all went through this winter, that was the coldest 3 days in a row in DFW history in the 123 years. That was the coldest 3 days in a row ever. There were crazy things about how cold that air was. On the 14th, on Valentine's Day, the daytime high was 14 degrees. Even now, that doesn't even seem that happened. That seems so improbable. That was the high that day, was 14, on the 14th. The record low on that day, up to then, the record low was 18. In other words, on Valentine's 14th, the coldest morning ever was 18 degrees. That day, the high was below that. So if you think in standard deviations like I do, that's the 4th standard deviation. So that's a 1 in 1,000-year event. And then it was over. Remember? We had that really warm summer, winter going, and then the coldest air we'd ever seen, ever. And then it was over. 6 days after a high of 18 degrees, transpose those numbers. 6 days later, it was 81 degrees, and we never looked back. Cold never came back. It was gone. Came down for basically a week and a half, and then winter was over. That was the winter we got. Most of what I'm talking about is inconvenient or something we can plan around. But when you get into major events, they could be catastrophic. All for the same reasons that we're seeing what's happening here. It's going on around the world, going around all of Texas. Harvey was a Category 4 hurricane that hit Texas. Had a lot of forward momentum, went into the hill country, took a loop, came back out, went to Louisiana. Everything you see in green here, that's 36 inches of rain or more. What's our annual rainfall? 36 inches. This is 5 days of rain. That's an area that got as much rain as we get in a year, they got around the Houston area. During the whole summer, we get 10 inches of rain, about. Pearland, which is just outside of Houston, got that amount in 90 minutes. What we get in an entire summer, they got 90 minutes. These unbelievable rain events seem to be the new norm. Hurricane Harvey in 2017 was the costliest weather event in Texas history. Cost us about $150 billion in losses. It was the biggest tropical rain event in U.S. history. There by the channel, the town of Nederland. They got over 60 inches of rain over a 5-day period. That's the biggest rain event ever in U.S. history. The average cover, the aerial coverage of 20 inches of rain, areas that got at least 20 inches of rain, think about that. My backyard 3 years ago got 5 inches of rain one day. And I was astounded how much rain that was. Astounded. Watching it, the deluge just come down for hours and just thinking, oh my goodness, we're going to have to use a boat to get out of my house. And this is an area that got 20 inches of rain over 5 days, the size of West Virginia. The storm itself, like I said, had a lot of forward momentum. It stayed a tropical storm the whole time. It stayed on land as a tropical storm for 117 hours. That bested the record by about 2 days. So it was such an unbelievably unusual event of tremendous rain impact. They estimated that the amount of rain that fell on Texas over the 5-day period was 19 trillion gallons. And I had to do a little math. That covers the state of Texas in 5 inches of water. That's how much water fell from Harvey in 5 days. Covers the entire state of Texas in 5 inches of water. So probably the biggest thing that attributed to Harvey was the fact that the Gulf of Mexico is getting warmer and warmer, not just at the surface, deeper and deeper that warm water is. It's powerful. It's powering tropical storms and hurricanes, and they're intensifying quickly. They're bringing more water with them when they come on shore. As the Gulf of Mexico warms up, it means a lot of things for us. One, it actually picks up the winds for us during the afternoon. It brings up the humidity during the summer. It makes for more tornadoes in the spring. Not so much for us. It does have an effect on us. The bigger effect really is in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, which is now the new tornado belt, by the way. they have a greater tornado frequency in the Dixie tornado alley now. And a lot of that is attributed to the fact that the Gulf of Mexico is getting warmer and warmer. If you talk about total amount of energy stored in that body of water, it is the warmest body of water on this planet. And it's getting warmer. As I look at all this stuff, as a gardener, I think about, okay, what can I do? Well, if I was going to advise anybody, the first thing I would say, raise your beds. Because I lost a lot of plants when I first moved into my house from heavy rain events. These 3-inch, 4-inch rains were going on, drowning my plants. So I raised my beds. My entire backyard is none but raised beds. That helps mediate the risk of the big rain events. Because of the hotter summers, my entire yard is planned against my neighbor's live oak because he's west of me. I shade my backyard with that tree and shade cloth to avoid afternoon sun on all my beds. Because as we get hotter, that's going to become more and more brutal for that July-August run, trying to get my plant to get through the heat. I'm going to shade them during the afternoons. Raised beds, shaded afternoons. I'm a big champion now of frost cloth. Before I'd go, maybe I'll save it, maybe I won't. Now I just run out there and I cover everything, because I tell you what's going to be happening. Because I've already seen this happen, and I think you have too. Winter's going to end early. We'll still get some freezes later on. And there'll be probably 1 or 2 nights. Cover everything, water deeply, get through those 2 cold nights, and you're probably going to have a spring that ends up starting about a month earlier than it should. So I'm a big champion of using frost cloth. I grow my transplants indoors leading up to the season, both fall and spring, because I want to look at the weather and just jump out there and get stuff started. I need to be nimble now. I can usually see the cold air coming a couple of weeks out. And if I don't see it coming, I'm going to put those transplants out early. And if I do hit a cold spell, I'll cover them with cloth. I'm also a big fan of drip irrigation, a big proponent of it, under the mulch. Again, if you try to fight that heat with water, it gets really expensive. So big mulch, drip irrigation, keep that soil wet, down deep. Water on occasion, but water deep. And because of the warmer nights, to take the stress off of the plants, I used to water in the morning, now I water in the evening. And I'm doing that to cool the beds down, cool the plants down. Try to get that heat out of the beds during the summer so my plants can stay healthier. That's how I'm adapting. So if you have any questions, I'm going to stay after the meeting. I'll try to answer what I can. As I tell people, I am not a master gardener, but I play one on TV. So I don't have many answers at all about plants. I can talk ad nauseum, obviously, about the weather. That's kind of what I do for a living, obnoxiously so sometimes, but I can talk to you about weather and how it affects your garden, because that's why I garden. I have to say, plugged into the weather. Nothing plugs you into the weather more than trying to get a crop out of the ground. I don't know why it's come back to high school again, but if you're on Facebook and you like my meteorologist Jeff Ray page, because my boss thinks that makes me popular, and if you're on Twitter, follow me. Quite honestly, I post almost every day some kind of weather tidbit of what's going on, what's expected, what has happened, to kind of, like I do, keep you plugged in what's going on with the weather, what's coming down the pike, because gardening is all about keeping your eye on the sky, right? All right. Yes?
Tell them when you're gardening 101.
Oh, right. Speaking of shameless self-promotion, we shoot these on usually Mondays or Tuesdays. They run on Wednesdays at 4 o'clock. They'll run again in the morning show on Thursday. If you download the CBSN app, which is actually really great because it's got news from all over the country, we're one of the CBSN stations, and it will run all day on Thursday on CBSN and our DFW station. And then it runs again usually Saturday morning because I do the weather on Saturday morning and I make them show it. So, hey, well, if you want me, you got to take my package. Gardening 101. And they're pretty short, you know. I mean, they're usually 2 minutes, so it's not a big sacrifice for them. So I appreciate you watching those. If there's no questions, I think there's going to be a business part of this meeting. I don't want to take any more of your time. But any questions? Yes, ma'am. A keyhole garden? No. What is that? It's probably the best invitation I'll get today. Yes, ma'am.
What do you do? How do you structure your shade cloth to provide shade in those gardens?
It's a good question. I take 12-foot aluminum fence poles and 2 bags of concrete. And then I tether them off in opposite directions or 90-degree angles. And from the top of that pole, I attach fasteners that my shade cloth attaches to. In some instances, I'm just running guiding wire and I'm attaching my shade cloth, I'm positioning it in a specific place along those guide wires that really surround my entire yard. So I can adjust my shade cloth to exactly where I need it. I also cover a pool, by the way, because I don't want my pool water to heat up during the day, so it can cool down during the nighttime lows. And if you have that problem where it's bath water in your pool, all you got to do is keep it out of the daytime sun during the afternoon, and that way it can cool to the morning temperature through the overnight hours. It's a beautiful thing about water. It holds heat and gets rid of it, slowly but surely. Anybody else? One last thing. Sorry. I feel obligated in my public speaking to do this. And if you tell my boss, I'll probably get in trouble. In Mark 3:25, it says, "If a house be divided against itself, the house cannot stand." In Matthew 12:25, this is Jesus talking. "Every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation." Jesus told us that. "United we stand, divided we fall." Patrick Henry. That was the last speech he ever made. He collapsed. They drug him to a building from the speaker's podium. He died 3 months later. It's the last time he was in public. That's what he said. If you believe any of these lines, if you believe any of this is true, we should ask ourselves 2 questions. Right now, is this even a country? And 2, maybe we should stop thinking about how we're different and start thinking about how we're the same. Thank you.